I typically do this session for VMware user groups. So typically for groups that do not do any automation in the least. So I have to make it very simplistic and easy to follow and not scare people with anything more intrusive than copy paste. But hopefully this is useful for you, because I like using this tool for the fact that it is focused on infrastructure admins that do not do automation, and it tries to easily walk them through a few steps to do the basics and get down the process more than anything. So that's really what it is that I want to present about. So thanks to our sponsors, obviously. I love and use every one of these other than Patch My PC. Unfortunately, I just don't have an environment where I can leverage that anymore. But please thank the sponsors. Please go talk to them. As a vendor myself, we absolutely love getting the interaction and having people tell us that it's meaningful for us to be here at these events. Who am I? I'm Joe Houghes, currently a senior solutions architect at Pure Storage, hence all the orange. I just try and keep people safe in traffic. I'm also a PowerShell and a VMware user group leader for the Denver, Colorado chapters. I've been a user group leader for going on about 9 years now with a bunch of different chapters. Also a Veeam Vanguard, VMware vExpert Pro, Cisco Champion, and Tanzu Vanguard. Mostly I put this up here just to show people that even for a lot of us that are connected in these communities and speak at a lot of these events, there are tons of things we do not know. Sometimes my value to a company or to a community is just the fact that I don't know the answer, but I can easily find someone who will, let me beg a favor for them to explain what it is. So absolutely connect yourselves with these communities and ask people questions. I love that we get to do these interactive sessions where we are not just speaking at people, but we actually get to talk to them. As I tell for every presentation where I'm talking basics of automation, and especially moving from things that we currently do to what is, the next step in our evolution, I want everyone to start with a plan. First of all, I want to define a goal. For this, I want you to be explicit about what things you need to accomplish, right? Determine what it is that is your end goal. Partially for all the same difficulties we fight with IT projects. Make sure you don't have scope creep. Make sure you have a defined end to what it is, especially when you're working on automation projects. You will never reach the end if you don't tell yourself I'm done. But also, I want everyone to be explicit with tasks and with specific points that you have to hit within what it is that you were trying to do. Speed and performance, especially when I speak to PowerShell folks, I have to remind them that this is an advantage of what you are doing, but this should not be the goal of what it is that you're doing with everything. This is an advantage to your organization, but really the benefit that your organization gets out of this is standardization and repeatability, right? The fact that you can hopefully do automation to then document a business process in the most efficient way possible, because that's really what you're doing, and sell it to your business leaders that way. And you want to make this a problem that everyone else can solve. It's no longer reliant on you. Other people can do this with your knowledge put into these tools and these automations that you're putting in place. So again, focus again on the efficiencies gained and what things you can do to improve a process over time. Even if this is just questioning what exists currently, documenting what it is, writing down your risks, your assumptions, or constraints, and putting these things into your automation, into your code. So as there are changes inside of your environment, you can determine if your process automation needs to update with your process updating itself. And then MVP, right? Not Microsoft MVP, minimum viable product. You started with a goal. You have things that you need to do. Accomplish that before you move on to the next steps, right? Finish the thing that you defined was the end goal that you had at the beginning before you start tackling new features or performance improvements. It's better to have something that is complete, but not as efficient as it could be, than to constantly be chasing performance and not actually have it do the task it's supposed to do. When we start looking at VMware, which API is it that we're going to be talking to, right? I mostly just try and explain this for folks that did not grow up with VMware, nerds that did not come up with vSphere 3 like I did. The SOAP API is the older API, both the protocol and a standard. This is what's actually leveraged by PowerCLI and things like PyVMommy. They've been around for a long time. It's XML based. It's very rigid. It is not a simple object access protocol as it is described. But there are many, many more examples for usage. It's a lot easier for people to pick up things that have been in blog posts for 8 to 10 years now for things they can just copy and paste and run inside of an environment, especially for the fact that a lot of these folks that come into automation from the operation side and from the VMware side did not learn PowerShell other than as a tool to manage their vSphere environments. They don't understand the underlying things that come in with .NET. They don't understand a lot of the thought process that went into PowerShell from the very beginning, and then therefore don't have that knowledge when they try and move forward to APIs. Now, when we flip over to the other side and look at the REST APIs, this is going to be the architecture that all the newer APIs have. There are some features that are only being put into the REST APIs for VMware. They're not being backported to the SOAP APIs. But this is obviously what we want everyone to learn, because then you can take these things that you learn here, even if it's just how to read the documents or how to do a simple process, and you can take this to tools that exist outside of your VMware environment. And then which level for the API access? When we're looking at all of our built-in PowerCLI commandlets, our get cluster, get host, get VM, the majority of the use cases that we have are addressed with these native PowerCLI commandlets. They're very easy to read. They have pipeline capabilities, and these abstract the APIs. What it returns back to you is what we would expect to see inside of PowerShell. It's going to be essentially a .NET formatted, leveraging a PS1 XML file for the predefined types of a subset of properties that come back with these objects. It works exactly like we would expect for a PowerShell object, but it has overhead because it's going to wrap these raw results that come in to do the formatting to make it seem like something someone expects to work with within PowerShell. When we get to low-level API access, primarily this is going to be leveraging a commandlet that's called get-view. The same API access that comes across for this, whether you leverage the API itself directly, whether you do get-view, or whether you even use the extension data properties that exist on your inventory objects, all of this is the same exact results that come back. But rather than it being a PowerShell type view that you're expecting where it's going to have predefined properties that just come back with the object, this gives you a categorical view. We'll see this a little bit easier when we actually jump into the code and do this, but it's not always easy to read. It's you actually leveraging an API, so it was primarily intended for development consumption, not operations consumption. So you need to understand the API. You need to actually read the friendly manuals, but it's not get help. So with this, we will just go ahead and jump straight into demos for a bit. Let's see if we can stop slideshow. We'll flip over. Hey, I think it actually switched today. Okay. As long as we can get back to our remote environment. Okay, so at this point, really just want to jump in and start looking at some of the performance aspects, right? What happens when we're using our native PowerCLI commandlets versus things that come back from get-view. So if I can get this Explorer to collapse. Hopefully the colors come across decently well. I tried to find something that wasn't horrendous for everyone to see. So what we're going to do is just do an easy comparison of the .NET objects that come back from the native PowerCLI commandlets versus the objects that come back with us using get-view. And I'm running a simple stopwatch. I find this is typically better results for me than using measure command. Not exactly sure why, but it works, so I stick with it. And everything is running a little bit slow today. So please, nobody crush the Wi-Fi, nobody streaming movies in the back. All right, we will get this running here, and then we will get everything running in my next tab, and we will just do a comparison. So for right now, this is just performance benefits of what happens when we run against the same environment with our native commandlets versus our... Oh, shoot, I'm sorry. I started with the wrong demo. Hold on. I should have absolutely done this in a different way. This Wi-Fi is not helping me today. So since I've asked everyone who's actually working with VMware environments, I assume that many of you are actually doing things with PowerCLI, but who's actually working with any of the vSphere APIs currently? That's more than I expected, so it's good to hear. It's really not a focus for a lot of VMware administrators, so it's very hard to convince a lot of them that they have any need to do these things when they primarily copy and paste things out of the existing documentation or existing blog posts. But it is nice to see that there are some people doing this. Wow, this is absolutely terrible. I'm sorry, now that my environment's back up, it's just the wireless that's not cooperating today. Okay, so running with git-view in this environment, we will see what everything looks like. Maybe. Oof. Okay, so 2 seconds for us to run these things with git-view. I'm sorry, with native PowerCLI commandlets versus what came back with git-view of 1.83 seconds. Not a significant difference, except for the fact that I only have probably about 40 VMs inside of this environment. The other thing to think about with this is running these things in a PowerShell method. I had to use 3 different commandlets. I used git VM to get these VM inventory objects. Then I piped this to git snapshot, then to select objects to get the specific properties that I was looking for, versus a single call to the API to run git view and then just skipping directly to the select object. If you can run one git against your environment and get the majority of the information that it is that you're looking for, even if you don't know where to find it, it's obviously less expensive to only get the information from an environment one time, as well as not having to do things with a pipeline, because that can be very, very expensive, especially as you think about doing this in larger and larger environments, or as you're looping through things. Obviously, these are just, the basics of PowerShell, but a lot of times we don't realize how expensive these calls are to do multiple calls for the same things, or with just piping from one to the next. So when we go look at what it is we actually get back for the results from this, the comparison on a .NET object versus the vSphere managed object, we can see, let's see if we can clear this and then get our results. So what's going to come back with this when we take a look at it is the results that come back when we're getting our .NET VM, again, our PowerShell view of this VM object. This is going to be something very similar to what we're going to expect, even if we were to connect to a process on an operating system. We're going to have a handful of properties that come back by default when we just get this list. So my .NET VM view just gives me the name of the VM, the power state, number of CPUs, and memory. Because at this point, they're trying to give you information that relates to the perspective of doing these things in operations and just getting an overview of this. But when I look at all the properties that exist inside of this list, it's still a very different view from what I get back from the .NET object that is returned compared to what it is that we're going to see when we go and look at the essentially API version of the object that comes back. So let me get my code up and we will copy and paste that as well. Come on. And if anyone either has any questions, feel free. Otherwise, I ramble a lot, so I will absolutely fill the entire 45 minutes if anybody wants to sit here and listen as we go through these things, especially if the demos run this slow. So feel free to interrupt at any point, and we will take a look at this stuff. And especially as you are trying to convert any of your code, especially if you actually use VMware inside of your environment and you're just trying to get more performance with the things that you are already doing, I suggest using a tool. There is the show-object commandlet that exists inside of the PowerShell cookbook module in the PS gallery. It is absolutely fantastic for discovering things. But what comes back when I run my view VM that comes back from this git view, again, essentially giving us the representation of what would return from the REST API. The view that I see here is a categorical layout of all of these different types of grouped properties that come back on a VM. My capabilities of a virtual machine, my config, my layout of files on disk, my storage, my resource pools, information about the runtime, information about the guest operating system, a summary of the virtual machine inventory object itself. A lot different than the view that comes back from the .NET of here's the CPU, here's the memory, here's the things that I would expect an operations person to be questioning about what's running an operating system, versus I'm trying to find out everything about this particular inventory object that lives in a tree view that we have that's inside of the API. And again, the other way to investigate a lot of this stuff is if I take this this view object and pipe it to show-object. If nobody's ever seen this tool, this thing is fantastic. It's been around since, I don't know, 2015 or something. I think that Lee Holmes wrote this, but When I go try and inspect things and try and find properties, especially as I'm trying to do reporting for the first time, I absolutely leverage this tool all the time. This gives me a tree view, essentially, where I can come through and find every property that it is that I'm looking for inside of any part of this tree to find this. Unfortunately, I cannot zoom this because this, again, it's been around forever and it's using some old .NET stuff that's in here, but makes it very easy within every level of this object that I have to be able to not only see all of my properties and methods that exist for this, but every place that I have some sort of a sub property. If I want to get information about the runtime, like at what point was this VM booted, I can find this information. To pull this out from native PowerCLI commandlets, if I remember right, this takes me about 3 different commands to get to where I can do that, unless I know where to find this information natively. Again, without having to change a lot of your scripts where you're already using commandlets and you want to just start modifying and pull this information in a different method. If I go back to my .NET VM object and I look at it with show object, there is a property that exists in this, if it will, there we go. Come on, do it again. All right, it's just taking a second. Also a hint, if you are using show object, it pops up this .NET tree view in the back end. If you do not close this window, your PowerShell console will hang, and I hate to admit how many times I have been frustrated because I thought my machine was locked up and I didn't realize there was just a window hidden in the background. So these things happen. Why? All right, so it's not liking my view on this today. Let me just show you this way. So if I look at this .NET VM object that comes back, there is a property, again, extension data that comes back. Oh, haha, that's why, .NET VM. Let's do this. This is what I get for trying to update some of my demos to make it easier for myself. There we go. Pulling up the correct object. So again, what's going to come back by default when I'm running my native PowerCLI commandlets for get-vm is going to give me an operations view of this, right? Again, I have my properties for my memory, my CPU, the guest operating system in this. But from this same object, part of why this thing is so expensive to do a call against it, there is this extension data property that's at the very bottom that gives me back the entirety of that view that I get from get-view. So this gives me essentially the entirety of the raw API results that come back and then does all of the formatting for us. So this is the same exact layout under extension data for this stuff. So just things to consider, even with PowerShell in general. You may want to look at how exactly a PowerShell toolkit or SDK is working against an application that you have inside of your environment, because they may be doing something that makes it very easy for you to work with a particular object type or results that you get back from a system or an API inside of PowerShell. But if they're doing that by returning things like a raw API result and then doing a bunch of wrappers and calculated properties and things on top of that, it might be significantly more expensive to use that toolkit than to just write your own code to get the very specific things that you actually need from your environment. It's obviously an investment in amount of time that it takes for you to use that. You're going to learn a lot more about how the system works, and in the end, it may end up being significantly more efficient for you to do that. It all depends. It's just a trade-off. This interactive script, I'm going to go ahead and run, and then I will show everybody what this thing does while it's going in the background. So we will run get-vm data. Man, this is so slow. I will save everybody the pain of me doing bad dad jokes, at least. So I'll make you'll suffer through that. Come on. Paste. There we go. All right. While this is running, we're going to take a look at this. So that took 1.34 seconds to run this. This was a script I had to put together actually when I was working at Veeam, because if anybody's worked with VMware and with PowerCLI a decent amount, there's a good chance that you know of the RV Tools utility. It's an open executable that exists online. Everybody can go grab this. This is the absolutely most efficient way for you to pull information out of your environment. I love having that utility inside of my environment, and even just running it in a scheduled task to always have a daily dump of everything that exists inside of my VMware inventory. The number of times that has saved me from having an outage and no one have any idea where anything was found, or if we lost our vCenter environment and had to find particular hosts that had specific VMs running to try and recover the environment. Having that always stashed in a spreadsheet because that ran at 3 o'clock in the morning or ran yesterday or the day before, and we had a starting point for some of this stuff was absolutely fantastic. But when I tried to get customers to run these tools inside of their environment, whether it was because of security or the fact that they had no idea what this utility was and didn't want to just sometimes grab some executables off the internet and run it inside of their environment, I gave them a different option. And normally I need this for sizing of backups. But in the end, it was significantly easier to be able to give customers a piece of code that even if they've never seen PowerShell before, they can open this even inside of Notepad and read through to just see the things that we were trying to gather about this stuff. And obviously, as I worked on this over time, I would improve things more and more. I changed it from native PowerCLI commandlets to using things like get view to eventually actually doing a copy that goes and directly scrapes all of this stuff out of the REST API. But you saw how expensive it was for me to just run git-vm in the beginning to just get information about all of my virtual machines. For this to pull properties of my virtual machines and all of my storage inside of my environment, my networking, my data store clusters, the physical hosts that are inside of the environment from the API view comes back in 1.34 seconds. That's a significant difference, even though it required me spending a lot more time just copying and pasting. And the majority of this was just copy and paste out of the results that come back from show-object, because you can get the relative paths for every one of these properties. So look for what it is you're trying to find, copy and paste essentially what's the same output you get from git-member. And you can pretty efficiently make some huge performance gains inside of your scripting and utilities by just spending a little bit of time to see what some other tools do and essentially just teach yourself based on other things that you can find that are available. I spend entirely too much time digging through other people's codes and learn all sorts of tricks and performance bits and everything from just, basically stealing stuff from other people's code everywhere that I can. This script I keep in here just to validate some of this, I guess, myself. I had someone who reached out to me at one point and said, hey, I need to make a change on my vCenter environments and I need to enable the bash shell. So even within vCenter, right, that is our management plane for our virtual environment that does all of our high availability and distributed resource scheduling and these things, there's two interfaces that you're typically going to have on a vCenter environment. One is the management of the appliance itself, essentially management of the operating system versus the management of the application and all the data that it's managing being the vCenter APIs. So when you're talking to the virtual appliance itself, the VM that's actually running and the operating system and services that are running on the back end of this, you have the ability to change the shell, right? You can either get into a bash shell or an appliance shell. There's a lot of times you need to change things like the certificates or need to do local account management of the appliance itself. And that can be a pain, especially if you have SSH locked down and don't go through and enable this. And he said, how do I change this? And I was like, well, either go log into the API and do this, or if you can't, go into the GUI and click it. He says, I don't have access to that. I need to do it in PowerShell. I was like, ooh, this is going to be painful. So in the end, I wrote this script that is 60-ish lines long, probably total. That in the end, all of this is wrapper for running SSH sessions, feeding streams, feeding in characters, and all of this to run either 3 or 2 lines of input for this. To change it to bash, I run shell, I run change shell, and I run logout. To change it back to the appliance shell, you do change shell and then logout. That's it. 60 lines of code to run what's essentially 2 lines if I could connect via SSH to do this. Or the more efficient way with this, because this in some environments has taken me 5 minutes per host just because of how slow it is that it restricts some of the access for some of these things to run on the virtual center appliance. And depending on how many things inside of that inventory that it's managing, those management services are rather busy on the back end. Versus inside of this, there's actually a CIS service that exists that you can work with very, very similar to a COM object inside of vCenter. For a lot of people, it did not come back, did not start out in the days of, say, like PowerShell 2.0 or even moving into 3. You probably didn't work with a whole lot of COM objects, right? You didn't have to like preload DLLs and try and dig through the code to find stuff, you know. But this is very useful. And one of the things I like about this a lot, which I will go ahead and try and see if I can log in to take a look at, is one of the reasons that I specifically use this to show people how to work with this is there are a decent number of IT admins, whether or not they know PowerShell, that are not fearful of getting in at a command line interface and at least just poking around and typing help to find things. So if I log into my vCenter environment, let's see, flashstack-vCenter. As long as I can get in here. I like this not only for trying to explain to people the distinction of working with two different APIs on an object, ones that are managing the management plane and ones that are managing the data plane, right? For some people, even just understanding the distinction of, say, an operating system and working with the overall OS that's containing this versus a service that's then being handed out to end users, it helps them to understand connecting to different API endpoints. And it's not super difficult, but trying to walk people through APIs for the first time can be somewhat painful. But I love having this interface that's here on the vCenter management services because of the fact that I now have command line and essentially the same dot sourcing you're going to have on a PowerShell object for the API itself. So I can show people this and say, okay, in this instance, we're connecting to com.vmware, and the API we're connecting to is the appliance API, which means the management plane of this virtual appliance we're running, not the data plane of vCenter, which hands out the management functions. Then it's going to have the same categorical type views of here is health, here is monitoring, here is NTP. And if I want to find information about this, this will even very easily show me what I can do with this. Can I get it? Can I set it? Can I test it? All right. When I'm doing a backup job, I can cancel, create, get, list without having to understand how to do things like finding out information about how to run a .NET overload or a method and not understanding what parameters go inside of this. Having something like this where people can come in and copy and paste and can basically just get help on this is fantastic. So if I go get my appliance monitoring, I say, I don't know what this is. Let me run help. Whoops. Come on. Oh, please tell me you didn't break this morning. My management service might be having some issues. Hey, of course. Let's do this. Let's just look at the services. So for being able to do a simple list of my appliance services, I can run list and it will give me back all of my information about this, and the same interaction that you would expect from running command line utility inside of most environments. It's even going to pause. It's going to give you pagination. It's going to do these things. It makes it very approachable to work with an API for the first time because this is not entirely different from a command line experience you're going to expect on most types of hosts. So I really like leveraging this tool. Even if people do not use VMware in the least, they can understand the abstract of most of what we're doing with this is talking to just an inventory object. It's in like a folder tree, and it's going to have a standard set of properties around things like the number of CPUs, the amount of memory, what disk, and what network it's attached to, right? So it's not completely unreasonable for people to at least follow along with that and to get into it. We can either run through invoke web request if everybody wants to see how to run this stuff directly in PowerShell, or if we want, we can actually just go through and create some VMs directly from the API. So, anybody? Cool. Let's just show this. So, two different utilities we're going to go through in this are going to be creating a basic API from the developer center that exists inside of vCenter. This is very similar to a Swagger API, but it is not exactly the same as a Swagger API. But inside of this vCenter, if I go into my vSphere client and if I go into Developer Center, I can actually explore the API that exists inside of this environment through this view. one of the things that I like about this and why I leverage this type of environment to try and show people things is something I'm going to click over and show in the documentation from the VMware side as well. But even though you would expect this to be an alphabetical view where this authentication token would show up first, the thing that shows up first is VM. And again, when we go look at the documentation for vCenter, with the APIs, when you go to the API reference, the first thing that pops up is this getting started with vSphere REST APIs in 5 minutes. And they're going to say that typically one of the first things that someone's going to try and do to understand is I'm going to authenticate, which you're already going to do when you log into the vCenter in the GUI or when you log in in PowerCLI, and they're going to want to create a virtual machine. So it walks you through just an operations view of these are things you may do in the GUI, you may already do inside of PowerCLI. This is just how to do it with an API. But some of these are things that we don't necessarily think about having to do in a specific step, right? When you authenticate in the GUI by just logging in with a username and password, or when you're doing the same thing with either a credential object or a saved credential you already have through PowerCLI, you don't realize that's going to be a little bit different from having to connect to an API and actually store some portion of that key that comes back. So even though we're not going to run the code, I want to at least show everybody real quick about how we do some of this stuff through invoke web request, just to kind of see this concept in code. So when we're doing this invoke web request, as it shows in the documentation, I connect over to this CIS session. So to save this easily, I have the name of my vCenter server, which is just the FQDN of the system I'm connecting to. And to build this out, I know that I go to /rest and then it's /com/VMware/CIS/session, which I can just pull straight out of the documentation. So I'm really just building a long string that's a URI. It's just an HTTP address that I'm connecting to. I'm going to give it a credential. I'm going to convert that to base 64, send it username and password, and I'm going to stash this header as a basic authentication. And then I basically just feed that into invoke REST method. If you've never done this before, there are tons and tons of walkthroughs on how to do this, but you can make this very easily by just building these things out in small components and making it something where you can swap a single variable and connects to multiple systems just in the way that you do all this. And you can still write it in a way that it's manageable code for you and it's understandable for someone that's never seen these things before. So what we're going to do with this is, since this API Explorer is already authenticated because we've logged in through the vCenter GUI, we don't have to do that step. So I'm going to go ahead and go back into that developer center. I'm going to go to this VM object that exists here, and we're just going to copy and paste some JSON. So inside of this VM object, we have a couple of different methods here. I'm not going to flip back to the slides for this, but you're going to have get, you're going to have post, you're going to have patch and delete typically. Get is just returning information, same as, get-child item. Post is typically going to be for new, so new-item, right? Then you're going to have delete, obviously it's going to be remove-item, or you're going to have a patch, which is going to be essentially set-item. You're going to set and make changes to an existing item that exists here. The thing we're trying to do inside of this is this post method. APIs can be a bit daunting when you first work with them because there are tons and tons of options that you have for everything that can be fed into the spec of a particular object that you're trying to work with. If I can get this thing to scroll properly, here we go. Let me look at this post method. And again, this is very similar to a view you're going to get from any Swagger UI for any virtual or for any service that you're working with. So if you can figure out some of these things inside of a tool that's pretty easy to manage, then a lot of this is very translatable. Come on, expand and stay open. So when I do this post method inside of here, it's going to give me the option to just try it out with this request body. If I have no idea what type of information that can go into the JSON object of this, I will, even with the scroll. All right, sorry, y'all, this is painful. If I don't know what this looks like and I want to see every option that's here, most of these interfaces will give you back essentially a blank shell of an object that you can work with. It can, again, be daunting to see every option that exists here. So if I can get back up into My top level VM object. Come on. Just page up. Okay. Inside of this post for my virtual machine, if I want to see the entirety of the spec that's here, again, most of these interfaces will give you something like this view that we can see what are all of the possible parameters that you can feed in for this by doing something like clicking on your description or your object type. When I click on vCenter VM create here, it will expand out my spec and it will show me everything I can possibly do inside of here, which ends up being, I think, about 400 lines of options. You don't need all of this stuff. All of the developer documentations with APIs are, I shouldn't say all, 99% of them are very, very good at explicitly telling you what are the minimum required things that you need. What is your minimum viable product to make this? For this vCenter environment, I know that it's very easy for me to copy and paste this. I need to give it the name of a virtual machine. I only put in the guest operating system just because I like to have these identified in there. And if I run demos or labs for any of these things, it's very easy for me to go scroll through and find or report on everything I have that says it's an MS-DOS system, and I know I can immediately wipe those out of my environment. But for placement of where this should live inside of my inventory, I need to give it a data store, a folder, and then a cluster object. But as you can see here, when you're working with an API, it's not the same as what you are going to have as a experience of working with a GUI or working with things inside of PowerShell where you're going to leverage names of objects. You are now working with object IDs. Within VMware specifically, you're actually working with the MoRef ID. So if you've ever heard that in the past, that's what it is. It's the Managed Object Reference ID. If you do not know how to find some of these things, instead of running a ton of gets inside of your environment, I will show you the easy way to cheat on a lot of these things. We'll go find my folder ID for this. That's probably easy enough. When you're browsing within a vCenter environment, when you go navigate to something that exists inside of your inventory, the URL itself will actually give you the object ID of what these things are. So instead of learning everything in the API or having this be an expensive operations process that you have to do by running tons of gets for every piece of information you need to get back, if you are going to have this information remain the same 80 to 90% of the time, you can just browse through and find this information. When I come inside of here, I have obviously my FQDN, I'm running in the GUI, I'm running an app, I'm looking at a folder view, and it tells me I'm navigating here, and under vMommy, it tells me the object type is folder, and it's this group 803142. So I can copy and paste that single piece of information that I need inside of here to get this folder. And once you're doing these things inside of these types of interfaces, let's see if I can collapse this object again, not have to scroll forever. It becomes very easy for you to determine what information you need to have. And a lot of the developer documentation for a lot of these platforms will tell you how to find these particular pieces of data that you need to feed inside of this. Come on, collapse the body object. Trying to not have to scroll through 4 pages to hit try it now. Nope, it's not going to work. So we're just going to do this. So I've copied and pasted a handful of lines of JSON in here. I'm going to have a button at the end that says execute. It will give you a pop-up and a warning. When you click on any of these interfaces inside of vCenter or within anything that runs within Swagger, it's going to have a button typically that says try it out. Try it out is not try it out. This is I'm doing this live right now. Only some platforms are nice enough to actually tell you this is really execute and run it now. But it's going to do this inside of your environment. So be careful and be certain of what it is you are trying to run, because this is going to happen. Wow, this is running really, really slow. This is at least a platform that's nice enough to give you a warning that this is actually going to cause modifications to your resources. A lot of times it just runs and either works or doesn't, and you may or may not know if you broke things inside of your environment the first handful of times that you're doing. One of the other nice things that I like about the way that VMware handles this is this gives you the curl requirement, which, especially as long as you're running PowerShell 7, you can just copy and paste this curl to a command line and be able to rerun these types of actions, or it becomes very easy to parse out what information is inside of the URI for what you're connecting to what was the header information that got passed back and forth, what is the data blob that got passed in JSON format. So if you're trying to learn how to interact with these things, you can take this curl and then paste it into curl to PS is a really awesome commandlet that exists out there as open source that will show you how to pull this information apart and understand what's actually getting passed back and forth with an API. So as you try and work with a different platform, you have an easier idea to understand from something you've done previously and what their documentation is, to use the documentation on platform number 2 and figure out how to try and pass this information back and forth. Since I get a response back of just this VM with an ID that tells me that this succeeded, and if I flip back to my inventory view, I will see a basic VM. At this point, we've copied and pasted some code. We have a virtual machine that exists in our environment, but this will not work, right? There's no definition of an actual disk or amount of CPU or memory. There's no actual resources for this virtual machine. I just gave it a folder, right, and a location to go sit essentially like in the inventory. This will not actually turn on. If you want to do that, you're going to have to build things out. This is where I try and challenge everyone to go look at a working machine that's in your environment, or copy and paste everything that you need out of that and keep only the parameters of anything that you potentially need to change inside of your environment, where you're going to actually define the resources for a virtual machine, and then do things like navigate around your inventory to figure out what networks you need to use, what folders you need to use, how much storage and where that's actually going to get placed on disk. So I'm going to do this again, and I'm going to copy a full VM from JSON. This entire file was built by going and getting a virtual machine inside of my environment and basically just navigating around and finding a different folder, a different network, and a different storage device on disk of where to put this. So you can go get all of this information you already have from something that exists inside of your environment and just change the values that you need to, and very easily write things against an API by just doing a lot of copy paste. It's really not that hard. Typically at the end of this, nobody dies. So let's click back down one. I can overwrite this information with this gigantic blob of JSON data that's here. And if I page down here, hopefully I got just enough time in the demo. Come on. Execute. Ooh, 35 seconds. May not make it. If anybody wants to stick around to see it, I promise you, this will not only actually create a VM in my environment, but when I tell it to, it will actually power up and boot up to trying to do a Windows install off of ISO. But as soon as you see this curl response, again, this time you will see much more information that comes back about this virtual machine. This is everything that got passed back and forth for all the properties and parameters. We have a new VM object that got created here inside of this testful API. And again, if I actually go to power this thing on, then it will boot up and try and load a Windows ISO to actually load an operating system on this machine. And again, all of this is pretty simple copy and paste. You just have to learn how to read the documentation a little bit, figure out what things you already have inside of your inventory, just learn the things that you can easily find the information for, and sometimes just leverage how to maybe find some other piece of information you don't quite have, and then try it out. So we'll see if this will actually start booting up just yet. Oh, come on. Network timeout. Oh, somebody probably deleted my ISO. Okay, so it didn't work, but maybe we're 99% of the way there, and then you can take and copy and paste this this code and go try it out in your environment. Oh, all right. This worked last week, but somebody blew up my environment on Monday. So, okay, demo is most of the way there. Hopefully this at least get everybody to think about some of the things they're doing for either more performant code in PowerShell or how to go try and learn the next new thing and maybe go play with a new API. And thank y'all for coming out.